unions in South Africa. He's written on left politics in South Africa, the ANC, but also has a wide range of interests. Has written on curriculum transformation and decolonization, particularly the curriculum change document at UCT, and more recently on right-wing populism in the South African context. But this is, I understand from his PhD research, and it is on corporate networks and class formation, focusing on South Africa. So I won't say anything more. Oh, just for those of you who don't know who I am, my name's Claire Lester, and I am a lecturer in sociology at Stellenbosch University. So I think I will let Niall take over. The format is that you have about 40 minutes to speak. You can use that full 40 minutes. Or of course, you can be shorter if you'd like. And then we will invite questions from people available. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, Niall.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks so much for that introduction. And thank you to the Sociology department for inviting me. I've actually just recently gotten back to South Africa, so it's really great to be starting to rebuild these kinds of connections, and very grateful to have the chance to present some of my research here. This is unfortunately the first time I'm using Teams, so if you'll just give me a second to get set up. Are you able to see my screen now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Great. And you can see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay. So the paper I'm going to present today came out of a side project that I started working on early in my doctoral studies. The paper that's come out of it is currently under review at an international political economy journal. And the sort of framing of the paper has evolved over that time. So when I pitched it to an international journal, I started to make it a lot more about trying to work out what are the generalizable theoretical lessons that we can learn about corporate networks that can be elicited from the South African experience. But really what initially motivated the project was that I was hoping it would be a launching pad for a longer term investigation of elite politics in post-apartheid South Africa, trying to get at questions about the changing political structure of the capitalist class, dynamics of interest and power, and questions of how it's dealt with racial integration and cohesion across sectors. So in this talk, I'm going to present the paper as I've written it, but I'm going to try to focus a little bit more about what we can learn from these findings about the interpretation of South African political economy. So let me start by telling you what an interlock is. So very simply, an interlock forms when two publicly listed companies share a director. So the director sitting on the board of each of these companies forms a tie between them. And when we aggregate all these ties, we get a network, which connects all of the different companies in a particular economy. Now, these networks have been a topic of intensive political and scholarly interest for more than 100 years now. They really first came to prominence during the sort of Gilded Age era in America, where you had the emergence of these big money trusts, people like JP Morgan buying up all these companies. And what Morgan was doing was putting himself on the directorship of these companies that he now owned. And so the corporate network became something like a map of power in the business system. You could see the networks extending from Morgan's core companies to all these subsidiaries, and it showed the kind of influence and the patterns of collusion and collaboration that were emerging around it. Now, in the subsequent period, after very many institutional changes, legislative changes, the function of interlocks has evolved considerably. And today there's kind of two dominant approaches to try to understand where do interlocks come from and what are the functions that they play. The first, organizational approaches, understands firms as organizations that are striving to survive in complex environments in which they're locked into chains of interdependencies with many other firms and other social and political actors. And interlocks perform two functions for these firms. Firstly, they help them to secure access to vital resources. And secondly, they help them to manage uncertainty in these environments. So firms integrate onto their boards directors from other companies that they believe will bring with them information and insights about the broader strategic field in which they're operating. The second approach focuses less on firms and more on the class actors that stand behind them. And what this approach says broadly is that interlocks fulfill the function of creating cohesion and of managing and harmonizing interests among different segments of the capitalist class. So you can see interlocks as sort of part of a bigger social infrastructure that includes things like elite schools, social clubs, retreats, all of these institutions that are important in socializing and in unifying the elite ideologically. Now, one issue with some of these early theories is that they put a great deal of attention on wealthy, powerful individuals as the kind of embodiment of the capitalist class. But actually what we find is that in most modern economies, it's not really individuals. Instead, it's the collective leadership of the dominant corporations that are responsible for making these high-level major economic decisions about investment, employment, etc. And so what that means is that if we're going to try to locate where the capitalist class exists in society, it makes more sense to locate it with a set of controlling positions of these corporations, right? And these corporations generally are themselves relatively cohesive political actors. They have well-defined interests. They engage in political strategies and in political coalition building, right? And I'm belaboring this little point of nuance over here, but the kind of key takeaway from this is this, that it seems pretty straightforward that we can regard these two theories, inter-organizational and inter-class theories by interlocks, as complementary, and as a very straightforward synthesis that we can come to if we simply recognize that the complex environments in which firms are striving to survive in are political as well as economic, right? It's not simply that they have to secure an adequate access to resources from their customers and their suppliers, but they have to ensure that policy making, that legislation is generally favorable to their interests. It allows them to continue turning a profit and to continue to remain in business. And so what that shows us is that interlocks are not simply instruments for commercial relationship building, but also for political relationship building. That's the very simple insight that we can derive from these theories. And there's now a very rich empirical literature that shows that corporate networks and interlocks play an important functional role in securing political cohesion in the elite through two main channels. One is, as I've suggested, they create personal social bonds across different parts of the elite, and they create lines of communication. Okay, and we have now a lot of evidence to suggest that and the presence of an interlock between two firms makes it far more likely that those firms will operate in the same ways politically. They'll donate to the same parties, they'll lobby around the same bills, etc. The second way that interlocks create cohesion is through the creation of what a guy called Michael Useem in the 80s called an inner circle. And you can think of the inner circle as a kind of elite within the elite. It's a small grouping of people that form what he called a political leading edge of the elite. So essentially, it takes on all of these leadership functions. It represents the interests of the capitalist class in general to the state and to other actors. And what Useem finds is that the main determinant of membership in this elite within the elite is network position. It tends to be the people that are most centrally located in the corporate network that are the most likely to become members of this inner circle. And part of the reason for that is that these people, these highly networked directors, are involved in firms from an array of different areas and segments of the economy. And so it gives them what is seen called class-wide rationality. They can appreciate interests and concerns that are relevant to the capitalist class as a whole. Now, the problem is that the second of these approaches has focused overwhelmingly on demonstrating the effects that networks have. And so a different literature is asking a different question. Instead, it's where networks come from and why is it that we see such variation in the patterns and the typologies, that's the structure of networks, across different places and across history, has then instead focused very narrowly on inter-organizational theories. And the kind of broad approach of this work is that what they've argued is that we can explain a lot of this variation in network patterns, mostly by the dominant economic institutions in an economy. And the main sort of theoretical touchstone for this work has been a school of comparative political economy called Varieties of Capitalism. And Variety of Capitalism creates a sort of typology of different ways that capitalism looks in different parts of the world based on its institutional structure. But it focuses mainly on a distinction that it draws between what it calls liberal market economies, which are typified by the UK and the US, and in which the main coordinating mechanism of the economy is a market nexus, which is to say the main way that economic actors, major firms, banks, the state, labor, interact with each other is through a market as customers and suppliers. That's what coordinates. The institutions of the economy generate this coordinating mechanism. And this is distinguished from what they call coordinated market economies, in which you're much more likely to find direct interpersonal modes of engagement, right? States bargaining directly with powerful labor actors, banks directly affiliated to companies, right? And the kind of key finding of this literature is that what we find is that networks in liberal market economies tend to be a lot more diffuse and fragmented and decentralized, whereas networks in coordinated market economies tend to be much more cohesive, dense, and structured. Now, what an interclass theory or a synthesis of interclass and organizational approaches would add to this is that we should expect also that network typologies will vary according to the way that the capitalist class is organized politically. And the most sort of broad hypothesis that I think we can derive from this is that patterns in the network will to a large extent reflect dynamics of class and social conflict in the society, such that in instances where the capitalist class finds itself challenged by other powerful social actors, say in labor or the state or other political parties, social actors that are able to put onto the political agenda policies and issues that have a bearing across a wide array of capitalist interests, right? That bear not just on specific sectors of the economy, but on the interests of the capitalist class as a whole. What you're likely to find is a drive towards cohesion in that class, right? The class is threatened by other social actors. And so there's going to be stronger incentives for firms to overcome local particularistic interests and to try to unify with and create coalitions across the class as a whole. Right, and there's various other things that we could hypothesize about how political dynamics will shape networking within the elite. So one big factor is going to be the nature of state-business relationships, right? If the state is much more interventionist, there's again going to be a stronger incentive for firms to find ways of developing direct political linkages to state bureaucrats or to party politicians, of course. And that's going to be influenced in various ways by the wider institutional environment. If there are formalized channels of engagement through which business actors can engage with the state, then it's going to look very different as if a situation in which business is much more dependent on individual or personalistic links to key politicians, right? So what this paper tries to do is to synthesize various approaches that have tried to understand corporate networks from a political and a class angle, and then to apply this synthesis to an understanding of the way that the corporate network has evolved in South Africa over the post-apartheid period. And I make the argument that South Africa presents a particularly interesting case study for this kind of project because of the dual transition, or the dual revolution that it goes through in the course of the 90s. On the one hand, of course, we have a political revolution, democratization, mass enfranchisement, the coming to power of a liberation movement. And this would, of course, completely rebalanced political power in the country and reshuffled political coalitions. So if the interclass theory tells us anything, it would suggest that we should see very different patterns emerging in the network as a result of these processes of political upheaval. But at the same time as we have this political transition, there's also a dramatic transformation in the economic institutions of the country, where you have a business system that's structured along very coordinated, personalized, hierarchical relationships, gives way to one that's modeled very closely on Anglo-Saxon lines. It basically comes to look very much like a liberal market economy. And South Africa is in many ways unique in terms of this transition. In the early days of globalization, it was widely predicted that as countries were going to integrate with a world system, there'd be a lot of pressure for their institutions to start to conform to the dominant American model. But that didn't really happen. And that's kind of where this theory around varieties of capitalism, et cetera, comes from. It's to try to explain how do you still get institutional variation in the world system despite globalization. But South Africa is an exception here. We see a very intense period of institutional transformation, and this should have also had very profound effects on the network. So it becomes an interesting opportunity to observe how networks evolve when transitioning between two broad institutional types. So I want to flesh this background out a little bit more. And let me start by talking about the institutional setup that we find on the eve of democracy. And the argument I make in the paper is that if we're going to try to locate South Africa among these different capitalist varieties, Then the closest variety that it bears a resemblance to is what's called hierarchical market economies that are commonly found in Latin America. And the most important factor here is the dominance within the apartheid economy of family-controlled business groups. And in fact, South Africa is relatively exceptional for the extent of the economic dominance and the concentration and centralization that is amassed by this tiny handful of corporations. So it's kind of 6 dominant business groups that by the early 90s is controlling literally 85% of the total value of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And these 2 prominent political economists writing in the mid-90s, Ben Fine and Zavre Rustamji, termed this cluster of corporations the minerals energy complex. And what they argue is that these companies primarily have a rooting originally in the mining sector and in industries linked to mining. And what happens in around the 1970s is, as a result of a proliferation of interlocks and ties between the different major conglomerates, you have an erosion of this historic division that had existed between Afrikaner and English-speaking capital. At the same time, these dominant firms start to integrate with and develop control over the financial sector. And when that happens, you get a consolidation of what Fine and Rustamji call the minerals energy complex. And their argument is that the enormous influence that this sector exercises and its control over a diverse areas of the economy allows it to function as what they call a system of accumulation. It shapes patterns of economic development across the economy as a whole. So we can think of the minerals energy complex as something like a dominant social bloc under apartheid. It's the kind of most powerful political coalition that exercises a major influence over policy making and over economic dynamics generally. And the coordinating mechanism within this minerals energy complex was clearly not a marketized one. Instead, what you had was a system of very strict top-down control, hierarchical control exercised particularly by the controlling individuals and families of these corporations, your Oppenheimers, Herzovs, Mennos, these types, right? And so they exercise strict control of the subsidiary firms within each of their business groups. And then relationships between each of the business groups, Anglo, for example, and Sanlam, Rembrandt, are conducted through a system of sort of gentlemanly agreements, right? It's the direct interpersonal networks and engagements of these controlling, of this sort of ultra elite within the economy, which of course overlaps and connects with very closely with the state elite. So one of the other institutional features of the system that's similar to other hierarchical market economies is very close collaboration with the state. And all of this, of course, underpinned by a repressive labor regime, something else that South Africa bears in common with other HMEs. So from a network standpoint, the main conclusion that we derive from this is that we should expect to find a network that is extremely cohesive, that is structured by the group system, and that in various ways reflects these power dynamics and this system of hierarchical top-down control. When I get to presenting some of the results, I'll talk in a bit more detail about what we should look at from a network standpoint. Now, over the 90s, this institutional system transforms completely, and we have a number of major developments. Firstly, we have the unbundling and internationalization of each of these conglomerates within the minerals energy complex. So they're selling off, breaking apart each of the subsidiaries. And then the major parent firms within them, they internationalize. They start looking outward towards external markets. And in certain cases, they even move their primary headquarters and their listings abroad. So we have a shift in this time then in the ownership structures of the economy, where before ultimate control was exercised by these controlling families at the top through these pyramidal ownership structures. Now what we find is that most firms come to be owned directly by constellations of institutional investors. So you move from family ownership to ownership by financial institutions. We have a dramatic transformation in systems of corporate governance, right? And here the connections of the South African capitalist class with the colonial metropole, with British capital, has a big influence in the institutions that develop. And we get a very Anglo model of corporate governance centered around what we call shareholder value orientation. This is just a system of running a corporation which says that its ultimate purpose is to produce a profit for shareholders, right? And that's the sole and only guiding objective of how it should be run. And you can distinguish this from various models of stakeholder capitalism, which says that firms have obligations to their employers and customers, etc. Bottom line is that this institution, like all of the new institutions that we develop over this time, are very emblematic of liberal market economies. So the other key factor here is a transformation in the financial sector. You get the integration of South African capital markets with the global system, and you get the rapid entrance of these foreign institutional investors into the country who start buying up South African companies, and they drive forward this process of restructuring and institutional transformation, right? And we can get into, at the end, I don't want to spend time on it, but if people are interested, we can talk about the reasons why this happens. And I think ultimately we need to have a sort of political explanation that underpins these processes of institutional transformation. But the big takeaway here is that what we're seeing over this period is a dramatic liberalization of the economy, a move towards an Anglo-Saxon liberal market institutional system. And what that should bring about is a dramatic process of fragmentation of the network. We should see a breakup of this cohesive MEC network into something that's much more fragmented and decentralized. But this hypothesis is modified once we start to factor in the political drivers of network formation. And what I'll argue ultimately is that democratization effectively exerts a kind of countervailing influence against these fragmentary pressures and starts to reinforce cohesion in the network. And it does so through two main channels. The first has to do with the balance of class power at a societal level and with the challenging political situation that South African capitalists find themselves with in the wake of the transition. Now, it's of course true that big business is extremely successful at steering the direction of a political transition in South Africa, maneuvering the ANC into a neoliberal corner and generating a social compromise that's broadly favorable to its interests, right? That forestalls any kind of radical redistribution. Nevertheless, in the course of democracy, business, of course, faces a very different political terrain, in which it's now confronted by much more powerful potential social adversaries, right? So the ANC, of course, comes to power. It develops this insuperable electoral majority. It lays hold of the state. And while a big part of the leadership of the party clearly starts to align with business and align with neoliberalism, a big part of the base of the party remains dedicated to something called a national democratic revolution. And that's certainly true of the left wing of the party, the Communist Party and the COSATU, which are rapidly growing in this period, and which are broadly dissatisfied with the social contract that emerges from the negotiated transition and are pushing the ANC for a return to these much more radical methods of redistribution. Right. And so what this would have done essentially is it would have meant that there's a very strong incentive for business to try to maintain its internal cohesion in the face of these challenges. And a more specific hypothesis that we get from some of the political economy scholarship is that what we see over this period is the minerals energy complex, this historic social bloc, essentially manages to weather all of these institutional changes in ownership and governance, and it continues to act as a coherent social and political coalition. And it continues to start to exercise a very strong influence over policy making and over politics under the democratic state. So this gives us a more specific hypothesis that we should see certain resources of cohesion maintained in the network around these historically dominant firms. So that's the first factor. The second factor has to do with processes of elite formation, because it's only so useful for capital to have restored its internal cohesion if it remained cut off from the people who hold governing power in the country. Because essentially what had happened in the democratic transition is that we'd arrived at a bifurcated elite sphere. Economic power remains with these historic corporations, but the ANC lays claim to the state, okay? And it pursues what some people call a liberationist approach to state transformation, which is to say that it eschews trying to set up the state as a neutral bureaucracy. Instead, as we know, it tries to develop direct control over all levers of power in the state through things like its cadre deployment policy, okay? And at the same time as the ANC, under this neoliberal framework that it adopts, starts to back off from some of the more radical transformation objectives that it had. So it doesn't go along with nationalization to any great extent. It still remains committed to using the state as a vehicle for transformation, and it retains an active role in the economy in various ways, through a lot of state-owned enterprises, through heavy regulation of industry, and eventually through things like its black economic empowerment policy. Which means that, again, the capitalist class or economic elites have a very strong incentive for trying to develop direct linkages to the new political class, right? And to try to ensure that they're developing allies in this movement that's now assumed state power. And we can see that the capitalist class effectively realizes this very early. And this is why already before the ANC comes to power, we have a phase of what's sometimes called informal black economic empowerment, in which major corporations are essentially spinning off part of their shares, offering equity buy-ins to emergent politically connected black capitalists, and also seats on their boards, right? And so clearly what elites are trying to do here is they're trying to cultivate allies, politically connected allies, in this new emergent business class that can act for them as effectively a new inner circle, right? It will form a kind of political leading edge of the class out of politically connected black directors that can represent the general interests of business to the new ANC government. And of course, we know that black economic empowerment eventually sort of gets taken out of the hands of private actors. It gets embodied in state legislation, and the ANC starts to pursue black economic empowerment for its own agendas. And its theory here is that it's going to create a black patriotic bourgeoisie, which will form a natural partner for some of the developmental and the political projects that it wants to undertake. So effectively, we have here a push from both the political and the economic elite to create a new inner circle, a new elite within the elite that can act as interlocutors between the state and business. And what I theorize is that this should effectively have had an impact of increasing cohesion and reinforcing cohesion within the network. So this is obviously a very different interpretation of elite politics to certain theories that are very prominent in the public domain right now around white monopoly capital, etc. And I'll try at the end to get to what this tells us about some of those debates. Okay, so the key hypothesis that emerges from this background is that we should see liberalization and democratization effectively exerting opposing pressures on the network. As a result of liberalization and all of this institutional transformation, we should see fragmentary pressures emerging in the network. But because of these political processes and the strong incentives that business has to maintain cohesion and to start to rebuild connections across different spheres of the elite, we should have had a cohering effect emerging. And so instead of a unilinear trend in which the network simply fragments and breaks up, what we should find is a remaking of the corporate network and new cohesive substructures emerging within it. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend much time discussing the methods that I use to test these hypotheses, and I'll spare you most of the kind of technical details about network analysis. But very broadly, the analysis is going to unfold in sort of two parts. The first is going to be a comparative historical analysis, in which I look at the macro structure of the network and I compare it to other countries, and I try to see whether this institutional change that we witness has a broad effect on the typology and the structure of the network. And then in the second phase, I'm going to zoom in on the contemporary network, the network in 2020, and I'm going to try to ask the question of whether the hiring of politically connected black directors has contributed to cohesion, has contributed to the integration of the elite more broadly. And I'll discuss the specific methods and the statistics that I use to try to answer those questions as I go through the results. I'm also not going to talk in any detail about the data that I use. All of the data in the study comes from a private company, Who Owns Whom, which conducts studies on control and ownership in public corporations. And if people are interested, happy to come back to this in the QA and talk about some of the specific things that I did to get the data ready. Okay, so the first set of results here. This table is comparing South Africa's corporate network in different periods to other countries. And it's focusing here on two particular statistics, density and multiplicity. Density is exactly as it sounds. It's effectively a measure of how thick the network is, how many ties on the network there are. And the intuitive way to think about it is that it's a measure of the number of ties in a network relative to the number of possible ties. And what we can see just by eyeballing it here is that the density of the South African network in the early 1990s, as we predicted, is far higher than more or less any other economy that we can find data for. And in fact, its network is much closer to these coordinated economies like Germany and France than it is to liberal economies like the UK and the USA. The second statistic here, multiplicity, refers to the number of thick ties in the network. So thick ties are interlocks that involve two or more directors. And the significance of that is interlocks of that kind are much more likely to represent relationships of control and power and formal coordination than they are other kind of functions like the sharing of information, right? And here you see, again, extraordinarily high multiplicity in the network in the early 1990s, which is broadly what we would expect given the hierarchical nature of the business system. So we can see this at a graphical level. So here's a presentation of the network in 1993. And what I've done here is to color the nodes according to the different MEC business groups, right? And the shaded areas over here are derived using a clustering algorithm. And effectively what they show is they pick out groups of nodes that have a higher frequency of ties with each other than with other parts of the network. And so what this shows is that these clusters overlap fairly closely with the different business groups. So the takeaway here is that the structure of the network is heavily influenced by the group structure of the economy. And we can see this even more clearly if we restrict the network only to interlocks involving two or more directors. This is what I call the two-core network. And here we can see very clearly, as Fine and Rustamji described it, 6 dominant axes of capital in the apartheid economy, each corresponding to one of these dominant MEC groups, right? And so we can see why there's such high multiplicity within the network, because in each of these groups, you have multiple overlapping directorates within these firms, which function as instruments of control and coordination. The other interesting thing to pick out about the network at this period is the position of banks, which are the labeled nodes on this graph. And you can see that they tend to occupy positions that are bridging between the different dominant groups. So they're kind of hubs within the network. And this is consistent with a pattern that we see in corporate networks around the world, in which major banks and financial institutions effectively become meeting points for different interest groups and different segments of the elite, and they help to coordinate class interests more broadly. So this graph is presenting network statistics of various kinds, which not worth getting into. What I want to draw your attention to here is the statistics on the number of interlockers in the 1993 network. And you can see here 260 interlockers. So these are people who are sitting on more than one company. So a giant share of the total number of directors. But what's even more significant is the high level of stratification that we get to among these well-networked directors. So the big 3 connectors, these are directors that are occupying 3 or more board seats. And this is typically where we find this inner circle, this kind of political leading edge of the capitalist class. But in the South African network, we have even higher levels of stratification. So we have a large grouping of directors that are occupying 5 or more board seats. And what I didn't put on the graph is at the pinnacle of the system, we find, I think it's 10 directors, each of whom are occupying 11 to 15 board seats. And it's right here where we see the top echelons of the capitalist elite, and where we find all of these dominant family controllers, your Ruperts and your Oppenheimers, etc. And these people are occupying a position in the network that looks very much like the position that the JP Morgans and the big money trusts occupied at the beginning of the Gilded Age that first drew attention to networks in South Africa. So what we see is that the network in the early 90s, very much like the Gilded Age, is effectively a kind of map of power in the business system, right? It's not just showing you kind of personal ties and lines of communication among different firms. It's really showing you the hierarchical top-down control that's exercised by a handful of super elites at the top of this system. So what happens to this network after apartheid? Well, it starts to fragment quite a bit, and you can see that just by looking at the density. In the first period up until 2005, we have a sort of halving of network density. But what I find when I look at this in slightly more detail, and I see I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to start to speed up a little bit, is that most of this fragmentation is driven by changeover in the population of firms. So you have a lot of companies going out of business at this time, right? But if we restrict our focus simply to the firms that remain in the sample over these 2 periods, right? And most of these are made up of the dominant, the more senior companies within the minerals energy complex. Instead, what we find is that there's actually an increase in the density of the sub-network structures around these firms, right? Which is clear indication, or provisional indication, that, as some people have argued, the minerals energy complex didn't simply break up at the end of apartheid, that it continued to act as a relatively coherent social bloc. So a densification of ties among these firms. And the interesting thing is that most of these ties are newly formed. So it's not simply the same old relationships reproducing themselves, but it's new forms of interlocking between these companies that had been historically involved in this old same political coalition. Over the next period, you see, again, further fragmentation of the network. And here the dynamics are slightly different. It's less about this process of churning and changeover in the population of firms, and it's more about the fact that this core itself now starts to fragment. So before in 2005, you had a very clear core periphery structure of the network. Now this old MEC groups start to break up a lot more. The network starts to look closer and closer to the kind of decentralized, fragmented form of liberal market economies. And we can see this very clearly if we look at the effect of size on the network. When the network was much more correlated with systems of power, it was the case that the largest firms tended to be much more central in the network. They had much more ties. Whereas by the time the network has liberalized considerably, it's much more decentralized. The size of a firm and its importance has much less of an impact on where it fits into the network. And so you can see again, if we come back to this comparative graph, that by the end of the 2010s, South Africa's network density is now much more comparable to other liberal economies, although it's still on the relatively cohesive side. And the part of the way that we can explain that is now by turning to the recent network and looking at these processes of elite formation and how they've affected cohesion. So here, firstly, is a graph of descriptive statistics about race in the network. And the first thing to see is that, as we would have expected, racial transformation happens fairly slowly at first. So by 2005, it's the case that only about 25% of the directorship of top corporations are Black, okay? And that directorship is also kind of represented in roughly equal terms within the inner circle, the highly networked directors. And at this stage, I don't have data on whether directors are, this PEP here stands for politically exposed. So this is an indicator of whether directors have political connections. I don't have data on that, but if you just go and look at the biographies of these directors in the inner circle, you can see very clearly that network position is correlated with political influence. So among the Black inner circle, for example, we find all members of the so-called Fab Four. These are the kind of iconic, emblematic figures of the early Black elite in South Africa, people like Cyril Ramaphosa, Patrice Motsepe, Saki Mokazoma. Okay, so there's a very slow integration of politically connected Black directors at this first phase. By 2020, the picture's changed considerably, and now Black directors make up close to 40% of the total directorship of all companies in the network. But where we can really see the most dramatic transformation is within the inner circle. And now what we see is that Black directors are overwhelmingly dominant within those highly networked positions. And when you look at who's occupying those positions, the vast majority of them are people who have political connections, they're politically exposed individuals. So this is a kind of initial indicator that what we're seeing is that the hiring and the integration of politically connected Black directors is forming a new cohesive substructure in the network. Okay, and this over here is now showing you the distribution of boards by their racial composition. And you can kind of see this pattern where in the early 1990s, most boards had just a handful, tiny handful of Black directors. By the late 2000s, that's transformed completely. These two statistics, which for the sake of time, I'm not going to try to elaborate on, are essentially trying to understand whether there's patterns of racial segregation in the network. So the IOD is an index of dissimilarity. And what it's trying to understand is it the case that we find most Black directors clustered on certain boards, while white directors occupy other boards, or are directors kind of broadly distributed across the economy? And the second statistic over here is looking at assortativity in the network. So what it's basically asking is it the case that firms that have a similar racial composition in the board tend to network together, or are networking patterns, again, generally desegregated, generally integrated? And basically what both of these statistics are showing is that the network is in fact very closely racially integrated, which is the kind of outcome we would expect if it's the case that white directors are trying to integrate with politically and to create cohesion across racial divides within the elite. Okay, so I'm running very badly on time. So the last thing that I try to do at an empirical level is I try to identify whether we can find within this network more cohesive substructures. And the basic point of this is that I'm trying to identify, is there a certain core of the network in which we find a cluster of firms with lots of dense overlapping ties? And there's a statistical procedure that I use to try to come to this. And what it does find is exactly this, that there's this kind of nested pattern to the network. Right at the center, we find a lot of dense clustering around a network core, which is then nested within concentric, slightly looser circles. And the purpose of why I'm doing this is I want to try to understand whether the hiring of politically connected black directors is what determines membership in this core and what ultimately builds those cohesive substructures. And you can see this initially just by looking at the descriptive statistics of these different segments of the network. And the key takeaway here is that we find that firms that find themselves at the core of the network have a far higher number or far higher percentage of politically connected directors on their board than firms that are more isolated and more distant within the network. And so the last thing I do then is I run two regressions. And the first dependent variable is network centrality. That's the number of ties a firm has. And the second dependent variable is membership in this central part of the network. And the main independent variables that I'm interested in is, again, the percentage of black and politically connected directors on a firm's board. And I control for a whole range of different factors here. And the key takeaway from this is that I find that indeed the hiring of politically connected directors is crucially important for determining position in the network. So it has a big impact on the centrality of a firm in the network, and it dramatically increases the likelihood that a firm will be a member of this inner part of the core. Okay, so a few kind of key takeaways from this. So the first thing is to try to demonstrate that these intra-class theories of why networks form and why networks vary can dramatically enrich our understanding of corporate networks. And while you can get a hell of a lot out of understanding how the South African network evolves just from looking at organizational theories, we would miss a considerable amount of the richer detail if we fail to understand how politically driven interlocking affects network patterns. And in fact, in South Africa, what we observe then is not simply this cohesive network breaking up under the effect of liberalization, but we have a kind of remaking of the network in which we find new cohesive substructures emerging, initially centered around these historically dominant political groups, and then around a kind of new social bloc that emerges around the networks of politically influential black directors. Okay, the second thing, and here's kind of where I want to take the focus, is to try to derive what we can say from these results about interpretations of South African political economy. And one of the main things is that I think that these findings start to undercut a theory of elite politics in South Africa that's become extremely prominent in the public domain. And broadly what this theory argues is that a kind of revanchist white elite has continued to hoard power in the corporate sector on a racial basis while conceding to only a smokescreen of transformation, and then deploying this power to try to undermine and derail broader attempts at transformation. Right? And these are, of course, theories that are associated with the term white monopoly capital, which has become a very central part of our political discourse in this country. Now, to call these theories, I think, is in a certain sense to misspeak. As I'm sure everybody's well aware, the term white monopoly capital does not have a scholarly provenance. It does not come from political scientists. In fact, it has a kind of sordid history coming from this public relations firm that was working for the Guptas. And its current circulation is primarily not a scholarly one. It's not really a concept that's investigated in any great detail by researchers. It primarily has a political circulation. It's used by political actors. But I think it nevertheless is a term that has a certain wide popular resonance in the country and is clearly very influential in our public debate. And I think part of the reason for that is that the term seems to express something that's fundamentally true about the nature of economic power in contemporary South Africa. So that a lot of people might not be invested in any way in the details of this theory, but they still think that it has, there's a sort of kernel of truth to it, a kind of common sense understanding that has some validity to it. And I think on that basis, it's a term and a concept that demands much more rigorous engagement from scholars that are involved in studying these kinds of questions. So I think there's kind of two ways in which the term white monopoly capital is used. One is a sort of vague descriptive sense that sort of points very broadly to the mere fact that economic power still tends to be concentrated in white hands in the corporate system. And the second, in a slightly more sophisticated sense, and here I think the kind of core claim that underpins it is that racial lines of division demarcate powerful interest groups within the elite. And that at the center of the power structure in South Africa is what old Marxists might have called a fraction of capital, a collection of interests that have sort of cohesive overlapping political interests and that operate together politically, right? And that the defining underpinning feature of this fraction of capital is its whiteness, that it essentially has fundamentally racial motivations in the way that it operates politically. Now, I think for this theory to be true, for this theory to be valid, two things would have to be true. Firstly, proponents of this theory would have to be able to identify within the business system a significant collection of firms and of capitalist interests in which white elites exercise something like uninhibited control, okay? Such that we can, there's the basic capacity in which white elites can now prioritize racial agendas in their political action, right? And then the second thing that we would have to demonstrate is that it is in fact the racial position and the racial interests of this group that fundamentally determines the way that they act politically. And I think one of the payoffs of this network approach is to undermine these theories. So if we return now quickly to this graph that is looking at the racial composition of boards in South Africa, what we see is that there's a very significant transformation in structures of power control at the directorship level that occurs over the 20 years of democracy. Now, one of the critical failings of white monopoly capital theory, I think, is to have fixated far too much on ownership statistics in trying to understand where power and control lies within the business sector. Whereas, in fact, as I sort of tried to allude to in this institutional history that I was covering earlier, what we have over this period is a dramatic transformation in structures of ownership and power, where these systems of family control give way to dispersed ownership. And what that means fundamentally is that the center of power in the business system does not primarily lie with shareholders and with owners, but instead with directors, with the boards and with the executives of these dominant corporations. And here we see a very different trend in transformation. While ownership still remains overwhelmingly white dominated, it's literally, I think, 2 or 3% direct black ownership of the JSE, the picture at a directorial level is significantly different, such that by 2020, a giant chunk of firms either have a majority of black directors on their board or a very significant minority. It's no longer an insignificant 10 or 20% of directors, right? And this then tells you that that kind of basic premise of white monopoly capital theory, that white elites remain in direct control of the dominant firms, doesn't hold true when we look at this at a directorial level. And indeed, to continue to claim that in the face of this kind of data, to me, requires the introduction of additional assumptions that are themselves have racist overtones. Because what one would have to believe is that in order for whites to continue to essentially exercise power in a racialized way, this 30 or 40% of black directors on these firms are essentially dupes or tokens, right? Their interests and their concerns can essentially be overridden, which is why it becomes a very problematic assumption to make once we look at things from this angle. So that's the first premise that I think this data starts to undercut. But I think it also starts to undercut the second premise of these theories, which is that there's any kind of fundamental divergence in the basic interests between white and black capital. And a big part of the reason for that is what the network shows is this picture of very strong integration and cohesion across different parts of the elite. And what we've learned more broadly from studies of corporate networks is that these networks have a very strong role in developing and articulating interests across different parts of the capitalist class, such that it, again, the group that tends to take responsibility for defining and acting on class interests across business are the group that comes out of the center of this network. And so what we've had is not simply a fairly dramatic redistribution of power towards black directors, but the integration of black directors into the most central parts of the network, which is to say, confirmation of the theory that black directorship forms the kind of inner circle, the political leading edge of the business class. So I had one or two other kind of takeaways I wanted to touch on, but I've gone quite a bit over time. So I think I'm going to pause it there, and hopefully we can get to those in the course of Q&As. So thank you very much.
Wow. It's pretty much every time I listen to you, I learn something new. I actually feel like it's echoing a bit. Maybe someone who's in the room can sort that out. Okay, it seems like it's a bit better now. I just thought I would tell everyone I actually met Niall when the year after my honors year backpacking around South America, and I met him at a backpackers in Sao Paulo, and yeah, first time he proceeded to school me on many things. But yeah, Niall, thank you very much. I think what you were able to do was to introduce concepts which were probably new to some people in the room. You explained concepts like minerals, energy complex, varieties of capitalism. For me, what was really valuable about what you're doing, the research that you're doing, is I've encountered a lot of research in sociology on sort of theorizing working class and working class politics and so forth, and not so much on actually looking at this corporate class. So thanks very much. I do see a hand by Shahid. I will also ask my question as the chair's privilege, and I think then we can do 2 questions, and thereafter Niall can answer them, and then I will open them for another round of questions. But considering what you have said and your initial findings, Niall, I would love to hear your take then on the concept of racial capitalism, which seems to, I also seems to be quite attractive in certain theories. So I would like to hear your opinion on that generally. But Shahid, if you will also ask your question, please.
Okay, thanks so much, Niall. I'm a colleague here in the department, Shahid Tayob, an anthropologist. I also work on questions of economy, but I mean ethnographically. My question is about, so basically listening to your paper, I mean, right, your main thing is this white monopoly capital, right? Now, except your critique of white monopoly capital hinges around the idea that it's motivation, that racism has something to do with motivation or race, right? Now, any serious consideration of race actually has thoroughly disbunked this idea, that it comes from inside, that it's an intentional motivation. The other thing that it seems your argument is resting on is this idea of uninhibited control, as if there's no uninhibited control and racial agenda, then somehow, you know, we've disproved the thing, right? The third thing that you are kind of basing your argument on is this idea of directorship, right? So really, this is a quantitative, phenotypical, right, analysis of directors. That's basically what it is, right? But of course, we understand corporations. I myself, for example, someone who's worked in corporations. Corporations are complex entities, right? They are large things. They don't really controlled by directors. So while I appreciate your critique of this, my question firstly is that the density of the network, right? We know that since things like corporate governance reports, right, the King Commission, it's like a global movement neoliberal, there's a movement away from centralization of companies. It doesn't mean that there's actually fragmentation, right? You've got Panama, you've got offshore, you've got SPVs, you've got all kinds of things going on. BEE is part of the SPV movement, right? So there's firstly like a quantitative question. If one measures this kind of thing only by looking at the central companies, one is potentially missing. So my question then for you is, have you considered that? Have you looked more broadly at the kinds of suppliers, the other kinds of shareholding arrangements that there might be, right, which may decrease this? And the only way to actually access that would be comparatively, right? So we have a case in South Africa where you showed us 40% of the top 5, right? That's quite huge. What's the comparison in places like America and places like Europe, right? That can prove that this density is actually decreasing. If it's still very high, then we have a continuation. The second question is related to this question of black directors, right? Because actually it's based on phenotype. You keep on speaking about black directors, you speak about historical forms of power. And I think you should actually speak about white directors, right, as well. That would be a lot more fair. But anyway, by debunking this question, what do you have to say about the fact that has been recorded in South Africa, right, that a lot of companies have basically put directors have actually put, I get your racial argument that, oh, it's a kind of a racist trope. I accept that. But what about the fact that we do know that when you look at boards of directors, there are placeholders there. There are people that were cleaners. There were people that were all kinds of things that have been made directors that don't have any power. So what do you have to say about that? The actual qualitative thing, and perhaps, you know, a detailed analysis could bring that in. Now, the core of your argument is the third part. It's like, you know, you say that because the black directors, right, are so central to the new core, right? You've shown a continuing cohesion, right, at the center. But then you turn around and say, this is proof that there's a new core forming, right? This black core. But by the same means, but it's the same companies that are there. So by the same means, I could just simply argue that all you've shown is that the old core, right, has been extremely efficient at bringing in black directors from the political elite, a move which would not be very surprising since democratic capitalism is never that removed, right, from state power in any kind of context. And we know this, I mean, since the 19th century. So is it the case that actually there's a new core being formed, or is it just the case? And my last point is simply to point that if we only look, what is your concept of the capitalist elite? Because you're speaking about this capitalist elite, you're talking about 1,000 people, 1,000 directors, right? What about the fact that a whole lot of small and medium enterprises are owned by the old, whatever you want to call them, upper classes, middle classes, white upper middle classes, that have direct spin-offs from corporations? Again, this is something which needs to be more ethnographically explored, but we constantly hear about it every now and again. People have written about it, right? Consulting as a massive industry, 2 billion rands every year, or some ridiculous amount, going into small enterprises. I live in Sea Point. You can walk around Sea Point, you'll see everybody's consulting, everybody's doing homework, right? There's a net, that's the network effect you speak about, and the way that this disbursement and the way that decentralization has taken place. So my question really is about bringing a qualitative analysis, but that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shahid. Yeah, so I said that we would do the 2 questions, and Niall, if you would answer those, mine, and respond to Shahid's comments as well as his questions, and then I will open the floor again. We do have time, so technically the time scheduled is until 1:30, so yeah, there's no need to rush through as well.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks, Shahid, for a very rich and challenging set of questions. Let me start by trying to address a few of Shahid's concerns with the paper. So firstly, on this question of racial motivation, and is some assumption about racial motivation necessary for theories of white monopoly capital? Now, let me start by saying that what I was trying to be careful to do here is to say that I'm critiquing a specific interpretation of white monopoly capital theory, and I acknowledge that there might be a multitude of ways in which the term is used. What I was trying to look at are claims that white monopoly capital forms and functions as something like a fraction of capital, which is, as I said, to say that it forms effectively a relatively unified and cohesive subset of the capitalist elite that has distinctive interests and a distinctive outlook. And here is where I would say it's necessary for that theory to make a certain claim that race is essential to the interests that drive the political action and the social action of this grouping. Otherwise, one could identify a grouping within the elite that might have a particular race, but if race is not the axis of social life that motivates, that actually drives what it does politically, then it becomes questionable as to why we would choose that as the defining feature of white monopoly capital. And here's where I think the theory runs into a serious problem, because the challenge that has not really been taken up by any of its advocates is to try to stipulate in any kind of clear detail what are the unique and distinctive interests of this group called white monopoly capital, and how might they be different from how other sectors and other groupings and other fractions within the elite might operate. And the real problem with the theory is that it's tended to rest on a very unhelpful and, in my mind, very unrealistic distinction drawn implicitly between white capital and something called a patriotic bourgeoisie, right? In the sense that The alternative to white monopoly capital would be black capitalists who effectively have a very different relationship to the development of the country, and who, unlike white monopoly capital, is sort of oriented externally, that tends to super exploit labor, etc. This kind of patriotic bourgeoisie would be willing to modify and to tamper its own economic interests in the service of some kind of broader developmental objective, right? And that's clearly just an unrealistic and an unhelpful distinction to draw on. And so what the challenge for any proponent of white monopoly capital theory is to say, how exactly does race intersect with and interlock with the political interest and the political action of dominant segments of capital? And that's a challenge I don't think has been taken up. I should be very careful to stipulate that I don't think that this critique entails assuming that race has no impact or no significance whatsoever in the economic interests or the political interests of the capitalist class. And in fact, this is exactly the kind of research agenda that I would be hoping a political project of a research project of this kind would eventually start to contribute to, is to get us to a much more realistic understanding of the potential ways that race does affect the outlook and the action of capital in this country. Because one of the problems with this debate is that the sort of counterpoint, the antagonist to white monopoly capital theory, has come overwhelmingly from sectors of the left, and particularly Marxist economists, who, to my mind, have made certain, very effective counter arguments, but have rested on, I would say, a kind of very structuralist first principles approach to Marxism, where the response has been effectively to say, well, how can you possibly try to differentiate fragments of the capitalist class by race when the really overriding feature about all of these people is that they're capitalists, and that it's really their position in the economic structure that always and everywhere overrides any kind of other political interests that they might develop, so that we can just read off from the simple fact of black capitalists, being in an economic structure that drives them to maximize profits, that they will behave in ways that are identical to white capitalists. And I think there's something misleading about this approach, even though the foundation of what it's trying to claim is incontrovertibly true, and that there will be no way that we can understand the way that black capital operates if we don't start by acknowledging its location within an economic system and the economic constraints imposed by it. But there's now a rich enough literature across comparative political economy that tells us that the institutional structures of business have an enormous impact in the ways that they operate and in the various potential for business to become developmental partners and to integrate with the economy in very distinctive ways. And I think that's the challenge for current research, is to say, if race matters in various ways, what are the specific ways it does? Right. What I was trying to challenge here is that I do not think race is as determining, as powerful a motivator in the political action of business that it makes sense to use this framework in which we divide fractions of the capitalist class according solely to their racial position. And in fact, then I think that the argument I'm making actually accords very closely with the point that you were raising about this not being a white core that gets replaced by a black core, but it's actually the integration of a black elite into the historic white centers of this network, which is effectively the argument that I was trying to demonstrate through these findings. I think the problem was I ran out of time and I tended to rush through them at the end. But I did focus a lot on black capitalists. The point of that was not to say that black capitalists come to supplant white capitalists. The point rather was to say exactly what you're arguing, that it was that white capital realized from very early on that there's a basic political expediency to them cultivating new allies in the emergent black elites, right? And finding key black leaders implanted in the same economic assets as them that can become representatives of their interests to this new state. So the cohesive core, and this is kind of, again, some of the statistics and the figures that I glossed over, is what emerges from some of the statistical analysis that I do at the end that shows that there is indeed a new core to this network. And what determines primarily membership within that core is the amount of black directors, politically connected black directors that a firm has hired, which is not to say that everything has shifted now to black directors or that black directors have supplanted the old white elite, but that it's based on an allegiance of these two fragments. There were a lot of other points that I tried to jot down here. a lot of what you were gesturing, I think, is extremely useful in terms of thinking about how we can broaden this kind of research agenda, because I think it is important to acknowledge that there are inherent limitations to this one paper, which is focused very much on the corporate elite and on the networks of interlocking directorates. But we have to acknowledge that this is only one slice of a much bigger institutional environment, and that it's hardly the case that firstly, that the business class only exists as this corporate elect. Of course, there's all sorts of linkages to small and medium enterprises, to private companies, as you note, but also that there are all sorts of other network infrastructures that have a very important role in managing relationships within the elite that happen through policy boards, through business associations, etc. And if we want to get to a much more complete understanding of the political structures of the capitalist class, we have to extend our analysis to those institutions as well. And I hope that that's a direction for future research. Claire's point on racial capitalism. So I don't have a particularly strong position on this term. I know that it's very in vogue at the moment. I think the problem is that it's clearly polysyllabic, right? There's lots of different meanings and definitions that are applied to racial capitalism. At the broadest definition of it, I think what it basically tries to argue is that structures of racism in society have co-evolved with capitalism in various ways, and that capitalism and its changing dynamics clearly has a determining influence on the rise and fall of different systems of racial domination, but that the causal arrow points back in the other direction as well, that racial systems change the operation of capitalism, right? And at that sort of basic descriptive level, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with the term. And I think it's a useful shorthand for describing very important dynamics in political economy. In the history of this country, of course, there's no better illustration of that. Okay, it's very clear that if we want to understand the transition across broad racial orders in South Africa, the transition from a system of segregation to apartheid, and before that from slavery, we clearly have to understand changing dynamics within the economy, the rise and consolidation of capitalism, urbanization, all of these things that come with it. But it's also the case that these co-evolving racial systems have a fundamental impact on the way that capitalism is structured and the way that it operates, such that one could not begin to understand apartheid capitalism, for example, if we do not understand how central structures of racism and racial domination were to the reproduction of class and to the securing of cheap migrant labor, for example, and to the whole systems of profitability that emerge around this. So insofar as the term sort of gives us this vague description that there are important causal interrelations between systems of racial domination and economic systems like capitalism, I think it's valuable. There is a slightly stronger usage of this term, and in which the fundamental claim here, I think, is that what racial capitalism is supposed to signify is that capitalism is dependent on systems of racism, right? That we cannot conceive of, we cannot begin to understand capitalism without understanding the fact that its survival and its reproduction relies on systems of racial oppression, such that we should abandon the use of the term capitalism and we should only stick to this conjoined category, racial capitalism. So what this is supposed to signify is the centrality of race in reproducing structures of capitalism in general. And here I have slightly more of a problem with the term. With that theory, because there's a much bigger challenge, right, for proponents of that theory to try to demonstrate why or how could it be the case that capitalism would cease to exist if racial structures of domination were taken away, right? So you have to develop quite clear causal arguments. You have to look at the mechanisms of racial domination and the way that they sustain processes of capital accumulation. And you have to effectively create a counterfactual scenario, which is what you always have to do in causal arguments of this kind. You have to imagine a situation in which you have capitalism in the way that it looks now, but you take away race from that system. And then you have to make the much stronger argument to say that if we take away those racial structures of domination, then capitalism would collapse, right? That to me is the only way I can make sense of this kind of core claim around theories of racial capitalism, that capitalism is dependent on racial systems of domination. And I frankly don't think that's true. I think that it is actually quite possible to imagine a very different kind of capitalism that would look totally different from the one that we have now, that is not reliant on systems of racism to survive, which is not to say, a very different kind of and much more politically salient point, that capitalism will in any way naturally evolve in that direction. I think if you want to have a non-racist capitalism, the only way it's going to come about is through social and political forces that essentially take up a challenge against capitalist power and limit and transform capitalist power. And that's the way in which I think if you want to get to that capitalism, you ultimately still have to have an anti-capitalist strategy. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that very thorough response to my question. It did look like Shahid perhaps wanted to respond, but there is another hand by Stephen Robbins. So I will take Stephen's question or comment. And Shahid, I'm not sure if you did want to come back. It's Stephen.
Yeah, thanks very much for a fascinating talk. Yeah, you've really, opened up a whole range of issues. I'm curious about, you use sort of Marxist concepts such as fractions of capital, and you kind of wed it with other institutional theory ideas and so on in a very productive way. But to what degree do you have to retool Valansis or Althusser, or whoever you use in this contemporary moment to make concepts like fractions of capital work for you? I'm just curious in that translation work you're doing around Marxist theory and other contemporary concepts and theorizations. Thanks very much for your really fascinating talk.
There isn't another hand right now, so you can respond. Shahid was just turning on his camera, so you weren't speaking to a blank screen.
Excuse me, thanks for that. So it's not actually, I haven't really engaged too deeply really with Poulantzas' theory or with theories of fractions of capital. I guess what I would say is that the dominant challenge for us at the moment perhaps is not necessarily the theoretical retooling, it's the much more careful empirical analysis that we need to undertake to come to a much clearer sense of how different parts of the capitalist class are structured. So I don't have any sort of problem with the notion of fractions of capital. I also don't think that on itself it carries terribly much weight. All it seems to do in most of the ways that it's deployed, at least I think in kind of more concrete analysis, is that it sort of collapses into basically just describing interest groups within the capitalist class that may or may not be dependent on deeper economic and social structures that bring about that alignment, right? And so for me, I think the challenge is not necessarily inventing new concepts, but it's undertaking the careful empirical work at an institutional level that can get us to an understanding of how the capitalist class has restructured itself. And so this was one of the other kind of conclusions that I wanted to draw out from this paper, is that I think it has quite big implications for some of the theoretical frameworks that have become dominant in recent South African political economy for understanding the changing structure of capitalism. And this is particularly in reference to this concept of a minerals energy complex. And as you can see in the kind of earlier set of findings that I produced in the paper, those results, I think, are quite supportive of this notion of a minerals energy complex as being the kind of dominant constellation of interests in the apartheid system. And the early picture of the network shows us very clearly this tightly interwoven complex of dominant corporations. And I think the term complex is very apposite as a description of that political actor, because it really is the cohesiveness and the overlapping interactions of these groups that is what allows it to exert this kind of outsized influence. And there was a kind of additional set of support for this theory in showing that the networks around this minerals energy complex do not disintegrate overnight when we have this transition to democracy. That in fact they persist for a great deal of time, and they continue to have this very important effect on the structure of the network as a whole, because you have this pattern of cohesive interlocking among these firms historically related to a minerals energy complex, except now no longer reliant on these sort of dominant individuals. You get kind of more horizontal overlaps between all of these firms that had previously been clustered together. And I think this is good suggestive evidence of all of these claims that the minerals energy complex continues to exert an extremely strong influence well into the democratic period. But the other key finding that I didn't really get to talking about in the literature is that that conclusion doesn't really hold true until the present. That actually at some point between 2005 and 2018, you start to see a much more comprehensive fragmentation and breaking up of the different interest groups around the MEC, consequent with a further unbundling of these groups and their transition to much more streamlined, focused firms, right? And I think this is significant because it's funny enough, over the same period in which there's been a dramatic revival of the notion of a minerals energy complex in the academic study of South African political economy, and very frequent invocations of the MEC in a range of different areas of research connected to energy, macroeconomic policy, etc., as being a kind of useful term for describing the structure of capitalism today. And what these results would suggest is that we need to possibly interrogate that in more detail. And one, I think, clear feature of this more recent research on the MEC is that very differently from the research that originated the concept, Fine and Rustamji's original work, it doesn't have the same institutional angle of approach. So it tends to derive most of its claims from a much stronger focus on the industrial structure of the economy. And I think this is what's really sustained the belief that the MEC persists right now, is that if you look at the industrial structure of South Africa, it remains very much concentrated in these historic minerals and energy interests. And you still see the same close pattern of input-output interlinkages between these sectors, right? So there's the same industrial complex that remains at the core of the economy. But in the original research, what was so distinctive and I think very powerful about it was there's this careful attempt to articulate those industrial structures with corporate institutions of ownership and governance, and show how that industrial base gets dominated by and gets concentrated in this core set of interrelated companies. And the contemporary research on the MEC doesn't feature the same institutional richness. So it focuses on industrial structure, but it has very little to say about dynamics of governance and ownership and political interplays within the corporate class. And I think there's certain misleading conclusions that get derived from that. So I think there's an urgent need to return to the same kind of spirit of analysis that was so effective of Fine and Rustamji's early on in their elaboration of this concept, that connected all of these things together. And I think that's the direction for research now.
Thanks for your question, Stephen and Niall, for that thorough response. We have another question from Bernard. So Bernard, you may ask your question.
Hi, thanks so much for
introduce yourself as well for those. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bernard Doubled in this department. Thanks for a very stimulating talk and I think quite a robust discussion so far. I'm curious just perhaps about, excuse me, sort of a small perhaps set of questions around the changing nature, international nature of the economy during the period that you're talking about. I mean, my reading of the mineral energies complex is really about the concentration of capital within South Africa. And I'm wondering about the internationalization of the economy. I mean, in various iterations, this has been called, people have spoken about, neoliberalism or globalization or financialization. And I'm wondering how this may affect or feed into the analysis, whether it changes, whether the kind of corporate and ownership structures in a financialized environment, whether we look at the same players and whether we have to look offshore and onshore, so to speak. I mean, I don't know that much about corporations, but I mean, it seems to me there might be something there. But then the second dimension of the question is also to think around the timelines that you suggest, which I think are incredibly interesting. From the late 80s, I think I sort of read you as saying or heard you as saying that these companies, these corporations start to diversify in terms of racial membership, including more Black directors and so on. And that doesn't quite sync with 1994 as a kind of political moment. It slightly predates that. Up to 2005, these boards remain relatively static. And after 2005, you get a change. So I'm interested in those in what those timelines do to our understandings of transition. You know, it's from a certain kind of maybe a political sociology, one would want to see 94 as a big break, but I wonder about breaks and continuities and what the implications for those are, given your analysis. So thank you. I think it's been very stimulating.
You can just respond now.
Okay, thanks very much for those comments. So internationalization, you know, of course, a crucial dynamic to understand everything that this talk has sort of tried to touch on in terms of changing structures of capital, and one that I didn't really have enough time to dwell on in any detail, even though I think it's itself is kind of, I think, the central issue to why we get such dramatic processes of institutional transformation occurring in the first place. So I sort of gestured a little bit in the talk about the fact that we need a political explanation for why we get this kind of transformation occurring. And I think at the center of that is trying to understand, why is it that the minerals energy complex and the kind of key leaders and the dominant elites within the minerals energy complex adopt this strategy of internationalization at the time of the political transition, even when there are kind of major risks that are entailed in this, right? It means exposing their companies and their groups to international competition. And the fundamental reason that I think that they do this is a political one. Essentially, you know, however successful they have been in kind of engineering the political transition in their interests, as I mentioned, they still enter democracy in a very threatening and challenging political place. And one of the fundamental strategies that they have of dealing with this, I think, is internationalization, and basically in two ways. Firstly, that they want to try to move assets abroad outside of the hands of the incoming ANC government. And secondly, that they want to discipline this new government to the forces of international financial markets, right? And all of this then entails dismantling these deep systems of protection that they had been hiding behind for most of their history, which then means facing up to the challenge of international competition. So once they alight on internationalization as a political strategy, a necessary corollary of that is deep institutional transformation in order to make their own firms able to survive and competitive in this new internationalized economy. So I think internationalization is very much at the center of why we get the kind of transformation that we do. And its effects, again, are very dramatic, because South Africa integrates in an extremely deep and rapid way in the global financial system. And again, I think some of this has to do with the way that the existing institutional structure of the economy, and in particular these very deep and powerful capital markets, predispose it towards this type of outcome. So these markets become favored by foreign institutional investors, in particular UK institutions, who have all of these personal and cultural ties to the country, and they very rapidly enter into and start to dominate the domestic equity market, right? And that's really what drives forward this process of institutional transformation, because they start buying up all of these firms from the MEC, and they start selling them off, and they start pressuring them towards this kind of restructuring process around shareholder value orientation and all of these kinds of things. And that means that from the very early days of democratization, we have this heavily internationalized economy. And if, again, we're going to take this research project in broader directions, and the point is to understand the dynamics of power and control in the business system, we absolutely cannot ignore that, because there's a giant subset of firms in this country for whom the dominant block holders, right, the institutions that hold the biggest majority of shares, are foreign international institutions, right? And that means that they're going to exercise an enormous influence over how these companies are run, over corporate governance, and in terms of the political action of these companies. So again, it's an extremely, I think, fruitful direction of research, but one, to my knowledge, that's not been taken up in any kind of detail by people working on this subject. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Niall. And what your research really sort of adds texture to is this idea, which I'm speaking now to the honors students whom have probably done a bit of Marx in their recent theory course with Bernard, but this idea that the state is a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie, and trying to use these maps and these visual representations that you've provided us with to to think through these theoretical ideas. Stephen, would you like to, I see your hands up again, so would you like to respond or ask another question?
Yeah, just a very brief one. Not that this is necessarily part of your research project, and you briefly mentioned it, this question of the social reproduction of this capitalist class and what's going on these days that's different to the past, and the networks of schools such as St. John's in Johannesburg and elsewhere, and what role that plays in all of this. So this kind of transgenerational dimension to what you're talking about. Is that something you're interested in? Are others writing about that? Yeah.
So I think it's something I'm definitely interested in. And I mean, again, I think it sort of reflects the relative underdevelopment of elite studies in South Africa that, to my knowledge, there isn't anybody that's taking up these questions in any great detail. There's sort of, I think South African sociology and political science is clearly characterized by a tendency to look downwards in where it's studying, which, you know, there's a lot admirable about that. But it does mean that South Africa has kind of been missed in this moment in which there's been a global revival of elite studies. That's obviously, you know, very centrally has a kind of clear motivation in our current Gilded Age and the emergence of all these inequalities and stuff. And I think the South African elite is so interesting for exactly that kind of angle, is because as a result of the political transition that we went through, we've had this kind of structural break in the elite, and we have these very unique circumstances in which there's this changeover in political power and a kind of not quite the similar changeover in economic power, and there has to be this process of elite remaking that emerges from this. And I think those kind of dynamics, which look again beyond sort of focusing solely on directorships and the center points of economic power, but understand the elite in its broader social life, right? And start to take in an analysis of all of these wider set of institutions, social clubs, schools, etc., which the deep research on these topics in other parts of the world have showed are critical institutions in socializing and cohering a new elite. There's fascinating studies to be done on that, right? And I think it's so, again, I mean, it's so sort of like obviously important at a political level, because we just see, I think recently in this country, how much intra-elite dynamics matter for the big picture political questions that are happening. And yet there are all these fascinating questions yet to be answered about how these processes of integration are occurring. So I personally am extremely fascinated, and I haven't encountered anybody who's working on these topics. And frankly, it's a little bit out of my sort of methodological area of expertise. I tend to do more quantitative stuff, but this is an area of research that's crying out for detailed ethnographic and qualitative work to dig into the bowels of these institutions and to see how they're dealing, frankly, with these questions of transformation. And I think that would be fascinating work to take on.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Stephen, because I do think it's important. Well, it doesn't look like there are other questions, and we are actually exactly on the time, which we planned to finish on. So thanks very much, Niall, for that intervention. Truly, I really found it stimulating, as did clearly others in the audience. And yeah, hope to see you in some of our other seminars. I'll share the links with you because, yeah, it'll be great to have your input in other talks. So, yeah,
Thank you so much. Thank you. Much appreciated for the invite.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, and I'll say goodbye, I guess. Thanks everyone else for joining, and also everyone who asked questions, Shahid for your intervention, Bernard, and Stephen. I do understand that I think for a lot of the honors and master students, I think the political economy things is a bit daunting, because there are usually some students who are always asking questions who maybe they're still trying to digest all of the information. But thanks very much. And yeah, I'll see you.
And thanks, Claire. Thanks very much for chairing.
No problem.
All the
Thanks.
best. Bye.
Bye, everyone.